Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 5, Ancient Greece, Section 1, Early Greece. And we're going to talk a little bit about two of the earliest of the ancient Greeks, kind of known as an era known as the pre-classical era. And we're going to talk about the Minoan and Mycenaean people. So we're going to first start with the Minoans. Their civilization formed on the island of Crete. Island of Crete is located in the Mediterranean Sea. This culture began sometime around 3000 BCE and kind of ended somewhere close to 1450 BCE. To the north, in what is basically mainland Greece, are the Mycenae people, or the people of Mycenae, the Mycenaeans. Uh, these people formed, or at least came to power, around 2700 BCE, and also ended somewhere very close to 1450 BCE. And in perspective to the rest of Europe, Greece is on the Balkan Peninsula, and it is surrounded obviously by nations like Macedonia and Turkey. So this is an area that we're going to talk about now, but we may come back and discuss a few things about it in terms of kind of more modern day history. So let's get into talking about Section 1. The Minoan and the Mycenaean cultures are alike in that they both had advanced civilizations based on trade around the Mediterranean or an Aegean Sea. They built huge palaces and temples. Some slight differences. The Minoans, for the most part, were what we call a maritime civilization because of their location on the island of Crete. A lot of what they did focused around trade and living on the sea. Whereas the Mycenaeans, because they were kind of in mainland Greece, their focus was a little bit more on agriculture. Not to say that they didn't trade, but they had ample land that they could actually raise crops and pasture animals. And when we talk about, kind of the legacies of the two, the Mycenaeans are kind of what we hear about when we hear or read the writings of Homer. So I think a lot of people attribute them being more classical. So the Minoans lived in Crete, and historians know that they had a form of writing. But the only problem is we don't have anything related to it, and we haven't really kind of wrapped our head around really the type of language that they had. It's still kind of a mystery to us. The Minoan people did have social classes, but we do know that women probably had a few more rights than what they did in the Mycenaean culture. Um, they did have a form of religion. And what's interesting is if you look at a lot of the art, a lot of it focuses around bulls. And that's probably because of this creature known as the Minotaur. Um, for the most part, there was a kind of a capital. And if you look at the map down below where it says Crete, uh, Knossos, the name that starts with the letter K there, Knossos was where our King Minos, who supposedly was the son of Zeus, he had his palace. And nearby his palace, he had this labyrinth, which is like a really crazy maze. And inside of that, that's where the Minotaur lived. And supposedly that's kind of this fascination where this comes from. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll take a look at the video here. But the Minoans, for the most part, they did a lot of trade, as I mentioned before. They traded around the Mediterranean, places like Egypt and Spain and even Turkey, modern day, well, where modern day Turkey is. Um, Copper and iron ore were really two of the big products that came out of here. The Mycenaeans, who were more in what we would call mainland Greece, are considered to be the first Greeks because they spoke a form of Greek language. Slightly different, but for the most part, this is where the language itself is really kind of based from. And when we talk about like Greek myths and hymns, they really kind of all reflect from this period of time. The downfall of the Mycenaeans is attributed to things like drought, famine, invasions from outsiders. They had the collapse of trade and war between the Mycenaean cities. Um, when we talk about their culture, the Mycenaeans were far more a military culture. They used horses in combat in comparison to the people of the Minoan culture. The Minoan culture were probably more trade based, but the Mycenaeans, for the most part, were more, I guess you could call military, if you want to call it that. They did have a very well guarded social society as far as classes were concerned. We didn't see a lot of mixing into the classes. Matter of fact, some of the higher classes, for the most part, lived kind of within the walls of the citadel, whereas if you were a middle class or lower class people, you lived outside of that. So, for the most part, it's a very, very structured society. During the Dark Age of the Mycenaeans, they lost some of their writing. This was a critical problem because the people could not communicate or keep accurate records. The common characteristics of most Greek city states was that they were located on a high area. This is called a polis or acropolis. Polis is really kind of a root that kind of attributes back to a term called city. And acropolis, you think about it as a rock. So it's kind of like the city built on a rock. The whole idea of having kind of the center of your community on this high area was for fortification in case you would ever be invaded. It contained your temples, it had a public market, and was also the home for your political system. So the Acropolis that you see pictured below, this is the one in Athens, and it's probably the most famous of all of these because of the iconic nature of it. Number 7, the birthplace of democracy happened in the city-state of Athens, and as we go along, we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. And number 8, the Acropolis was built on higher ground than the rest of the city-state, because of its importance in the culture and society. It also housed the temples to the gods and provided a place for public ceremonies. The Spartans, they placed such an emphasis on preparedness for war because it was seen as the only way to keep order in their society. In Sparta, the Helots, these were kind of the people who were not necessarily pure Spartans, but they did the farming. They performed a lot of the manual labor for Spartan society so that the Spartans could focus their time and efforts towards warfare. King Lycurgus, his system for training boys was very hard on young children, but also very effective in creating foot soldiers. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Spartan society probably in our next part of our notes here. Number 12, every 4 years, citizens of various city states would come together for the Olympic Games. This is where our athletes met to compete and honor the gods. When we talk about some of the different events, very different maybe than some of the ones that we kind of focus on today. Primarily, a lot of them were kind of involving track and field with running, javelin, discus, but you also saw things like wrestling and boxing involved in the Olympic Games as well. The fact that the Greek gods were flawed and unpredictable helped the Greek people relate to them because these gods seemed a little more human. Greek mythical heroes also provided examples of virtue and strength. And so a lot of your communities in ancient Greece basically had their own patron or patronates. It's kind of like when we talk about saints within the Catholic faith. You have your patron saints of certain communities. Well, in Athens, they had certain patrons of their communities as well, and temples would be built, and people would be there to help the ordinary citizens offer a sacrifice to. Thank you very much.